My parents screamed, "Get out, uneducated trash," and kicked me out of the house. "Get out, you parasite," my dad yelled, his face turning a dark shade of red. They had no idea I had built a $31 million empire from the ground up. I did not cry. I did not beg. I just looked at them, steady and cold, said, "Okay, fine," and left. 3 weeks later, the truth came out and completely destroyed their perfectly curated lives. But to understand how we got to that explosive night, you have to understand the family I was born into. My name is Evelyn. I am 32 years old, and for my entire life, I was the black sheep of a family that worshipped pieces of paper more than they worshipped their own children. I grew up in a wealthy, stifling suburb of Indianapolis. If you drove through our neighborhood, you would see manicured lawns, pristine driveways, and houses that all looked like they were trying to outdo each other. My family was exactly like those houses. Perfect on the outside, completely exhausting on the inside. My father, Harrison, was a mechanical engineer. He had worked at the same massive corporate firm for 35 years. To him, loyalty to a corporation, wearing a tie every day, and climbing a predictable, traditional ladder was the only measure of a person's worth. He kept his framed university degrees in the living room, right above the fireplace, like they were holy relics. He spoke in absolute certainties, and if you disagreed with his view of the world, you were not just wrong, you were a failure. My mother, Diana, was a middle school teacher. She had a soft voice but a very sharp, judgmental tongue. Her entire existence revolved around neighborhood gossip, country club appearances, and making sure everyone knew exactly how successful her children were. And by successful, she strictly meant traditional. She loved bumping into other mothers at the grocery store just so she could casually brag about test scores and university admissions. Then there were my older siblings, the golden children of the family. Preston, who is 35 now, was a banking brother through and through. He wore incredibly expensive suits, leased a new luxury car every 2 years to look richer than he actually was, and talked entirely in financial buzzwords. He walked into every room like he owned it, even if he was secretly drowning in credit card debt. Valerie, my 29-year-old sister, was a junior lawyer at a mid-sized firm. She loved bringing up her law degree in completely unrelated conversations. If you were talking about the weather, Valerie would find a way to pivot the conversation to a legal brief she was writing. They were exactly what my parents wanted: arrogant, credentialed, and obsessed with status. And then there was me. I was the glitch in their perfect system. I was the child who made them deeply uncomfortable because I simply did not care about the things they cared about. I never wanted the corner office. I never wanted the framed piece of paper on the wall. I hated the idea of sitting in a cubicle for 40 years just to get a gold watch and a pat on the back. My brain did not work in theories and textbooks. It worked in systems, in supply and demand, in looking at a problem and figuring out how to build a bridge over it. From a very young age, I was independent, observant, and fiercely stubborn. While Preston and Valerie were memorizing flashcards to get straight A's, I was out in the real world, trying to figure out how money actually moved. But in a house where achievement only counted if it came with a grading rubric and a teacher's signature, my natural entrepreneurial spirit was not seen as a gift. It was seen as an embarrassment. I was constantly told that my ideas were silly, that my projects were a waste of time, and that I needed to stop playing around and focus on a real future. Every dinner table conversation was a performance where my siblings took the stage, and I was just the audience, expected to clap for paths I had absolutely no desire to walk. That house was a pressure cooker of expectations, and I was the only one refusing to let them turn up the heat. It was only a matter of time before something had to give. The rejection of who I was did not start when I was an adult. It started very early, weaving its way into my childhood until it became the heavy, suffocating blanket I slept under every night. The clearest memory I have of this dynamic happened when I was 13 years old. While most kids my age were spending their weekends watching television or hanging out at the mall, I was operating a secret little enterprise out of the back corner of our garage. I had figured out a system. Every Saturday morning, I would wake up at 6 and ride my bike to the neighborhood yard sales. I would buy old, beat-up wooden stools, chipped ceramic bowls, and rusted metal signs for $1 or $2 each. I would haul them back to the garage, sand them down, repaint them with careful, steady hands, and give them a distressed, vintage look. But my real genius was not the painting. It was the marketing. I created handwritten, beautiful tags for each item, inventing rich, romantic histories for these discarded objects. A scratched bowl became a rustic farmhouse centerpiece. A wobbly stool became a vintage craftsman treasure. I started selling them online and to local antique vendors, marking up the prices by sometimes 500%. I was 13, and I was making real, solid money. I felt so proud. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had found something I was genuinely good at. I thought that if I could show my parents the cash I had earned, if I could show them the little ledger book where I tracked my expenses and profits, they would finally look at me the way they looked at Preston when he brought home a perfect math test. I was wrong. So incredibly wrong. One Thursday afternoon, my father came home early from his engineering firm. I was in the driveway, surrounded by half-painted wooden furniture, sanding a small table. He stepped out of his car, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the driveway, and stopped. He did not ask what I was doing. He did not ask how much I had made. He just stared at my workspace with a look of absolute, unvarnished disgust. "What is this trash doing in my driveway, Evelyn?" His voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that meant a storm was about to break. I stood up, wiping the sawdust on my jeans, and tried to explain. I told him about the profit margins. I told him about the customers. I reached into my pocket to show him the $80 I had made just that morning. He slapped the money out of my hand. The bills scattered across the concrete. "We are an educated family," he spat out, pointing a rigid finger at my face. "I am a senior engineer. Your mother is a respected teacher. We do not peddle junk on the side of the road like peasants. This is humiliating. What will the neighbors think, seeing my daughter acting like a garbage collector?" Before I could say another word, he grabbed the freshly painted stools, the vintage bowls, the little tags I had spent hours writing, and threw them all into the large green trash can by the side of the house. The loud crashes echoed through the quiet suburban street. He threw away weeks of my hard work in 30 seconds. "Clean this mess up," he commanded, turning his back on me. "And then go inside and open a book. A real book. Hustle is just poverty in disguise, Evelyn. Stop acting like a lowlife." I stood there in the driveway, watching him walk into the perfect house, feeling a cold, hard knot form in the center of my chest. I did not cry. I just bent down, picked up my scattered dollar bills, and realized a fundamental truth that would shape the rest of my life. My father did not want me to be successful. He wanted me to be compliant. He wanted me to fit into a neat, respectable little box that he could brag about at his country club. My skills, my creativity, my drive to build something from nothing, it was all a source of deep shame to him. That was the day the naive, hopeful part of me died. I knew right then that I would never get their approval, and more importantly, I realized that I needed to stop asking for it. The tension in our house simmered for years, finally reaching its boiling point when I was 19. I had enrolled in a respectable, though slightly boring, state university, mostly because fighting my parents felt more exhausting than just going along with their script. But every single day on that campus felt like I was wearing a suit of armor made of lead. I lasted exactly 3 semesters. Sitting in large lecture halls, listening to professors read from PowerPoint slides about business theory, felt like a joke to me. I had a marketing professor who had never actually run a business in his life, lecturing us on customer acquisition costs. Meanwhile, I was sitting in the back row of his class with my laptop open, secretly running a highly profitable e-commerce dropshipping business. I was managing inventory, negotiating with overseas suppliers, and dealing with real customer service crises while he droned on about hypothetical case studies from the 1990s. The disconnect between the academic theory I was paying thousands of dollars to learn and the actual blood, sweat, and tears of real commerce was massive. I was not lazy. I was misaligned. I was sitting in a classroom bleeding out slowly from boredom, knowing my real life was waiting for me out in the wild. So, one cold November evening, I packed up my dorm room, drove back to my parents' house, and walked into the living room where the whole family was gathered for Sunday dinner. I stood at the head of the table and announced that I was dropping out of college to run my business full-time. The silence that followed was so thick you could have choked on it. My father put his fork down slowly. The vein in his forehead began to pulse. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I repeated it, calmly. I told them I was wasting my time and their money. I told them I already had a steady stream of income and a solid plan to scale my operations. My mother immediately burst into theatrical tears, burying her face in her hands. Not because she was worried about my financial future, but because she was horrified at the social implications. "What am I going to tell the book club?" she wailed. "Diana's daughter, the college dropout. It is mortifying." Preston, who had just graduated and was wearing a tie on a Sunday just to feel important, let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Let her go, Dad," he sneered, swirling his glass of wine. "She thinks she is going to be the next big tech billionaire because she sold a few trinkets on the internet. Give it 6 months. She will be flipping burgers and begging to move back into the basement." Valerie just shook her head, looking at me like I was a lost cause. "You are completely delusional, Evelyn. You have no degree. You have no network. You are throwing away your life for a hobby." Then my father stood up. He did not look at me like a father looking at a daughter. He looked at me like a judge looking at a repeat offender. "You are choosing a life of humiliation," he shouted, slamming his hand on the dining table. "No respectable person will ever do business with a dropout. You think you are smarter than the system? You are nothing. You are throwing away the privilege we gave you because you are too arrogant to do the hard work. If you walk out that door without a degree, you do not ask me for a single dime. You are on your own." I looked at all of them. The judgment, the mockery, the absolute lack of faith in my abilities. I did not argue. I did not try to show them my spreadsheets or my profit margins. I knew it would be pointless. "Message received," I said softly. I went upstairs, packed my remaining clothes into 2 large suitcases, and left. I rented a tiny, miserable apartment on the east side of the city. It was located directly above a 24-hour laundromat. My apartment constantly smelled like cheap detergent and bleach, and the floor vibrated every time the industrial washing machines hit their spin cycle. I was 19 years old, completely cut off from my family, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, and eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. But as I lay there on my first night, listening to the hum of the washing machines below, I did not feel afraid. I felt free. The umbilical cord to their toxic expectations was finally severed, and the empire I was about to build was going to be mine, and mine alone. People love the idea of the young, rebellious entrepreneur who drops out of school and magically becomes a millionaire overnight. They love the highlight reel. But nobody talks about the brutal, bone-crushing reality of the years in between. My early 20s were not a glamorous montage of success. They were a brutal war of attrition, fought in the dark, completely alone. By the time I was 21, my initial e-commerce business had grown enough that I needed actual storage space. I signed a lease on a massive, run-down warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. It was cheap for a reason. The roof leaked during heavy rain, and the building had absolutely no heating system. That first winter was the hardest season of my entire life. I could not afford to pay my 2 part-time employees and pay for a commercial heating unit, so I chose my employees. I spent the months of December and January working in a building that was essentially a giant refrigerator. I would wear thermal underwear, 2 thick sweaters, a heavy winter coat, and fingerless gloves just so I could type on my laptop without my hands going completely numb. When I was too exhausted to drive back to my loud apartment above the laundromat, I would sleep in the warehouse on a makeshift bed of broken-down cardboard boxes, wrapped in a cheap sleeping bag. I survived on expired canned soup and instant ramen noodles because every single dollar of profit had to be reinvested into inventory. The stress was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. The darkest moment happened when an overseas supplier suddenly defaulted on a massive holiday shipment. I had already taken pre-orders. I had already spent the money on marketing. When the supplier ghosted me, taking $50,000 of my operating capital with them, I thought my life was over. I had to take out a predatory, high-interest loan just to refund my angry customers and keep the lights on. I remember sitting on the freezing concrete floor at 2 in the morning, my phone buzzing with angry customer emails, physically pulling out small clumps of my own hair because the anxiety was so intense. And where was my family during all of this? They were celebrating. I remember calling my mother on Thanksgiving from the freezing warehouse. I was eating a cold sandwich, shivering. I just wanted to hear a familiar voice. But the moment she answered, all she could talk about was Preston. Preston had just gotten his first big banking bonus. Preston had just leased a brand new luxury sedan. Preston was taking the family out to a 5-star steakhouse to celebrate. She did not ask if I was eating. She did not ask if I was warm. She just reminded me, with that sharp, passive-aggressive tone, that if I had just stayed in school, I could be eating steak with them instead of playing shopkeeper. I hung up the phone and cried. It was the only time I let myself cry during those years. The pain was not just about being broke. The pain was the brutal realization that my family would have preferred to see me miserable in a respectable, traditional job than see me struggling bravely on a path they could not understand or brag about. I did not ask them for a loan to cover the $50,000 loss. I knew exactly what would happen if I did. They would give me the money, but the price would be my soul. The "I told you so" speeches would last for decades. They would use my failure as a weapon to force me back into their mold. So, I swallowed my pride, drank another cup of cheap coffee, and went back to work. I fought off the debt over 6 agonizing months. I learned shipping rules, chargeback policies, and crisis management the hard way. Every setback was a lesson that no college professor could have ever taught me. I was being forged in the fire, and while it nearly burned me alive, it made me absolutely unbreakable. The turning point of my entire life did not happen in a shiny boardroom. It happened when I was 23, at a crowded, brightly lit regional trade expo in Louisville. I was there trying to source better domestic suppliers, dragging a cheap rolling suitcase full of product samples, running on exactly 3 hours of sleep and far too much caffeine. I was trying desperately not to look as exhausted and broke as I actually was. That was where I met Penelope. Penelope was a veteran in the retail world. She was a former senior buyer for several major national boutique chains. She was sharp, impeccably dressed, and had the kind of intense, piercing gaze that made you feel like she was reading the exact code of your DNA. We ended up sitting at the same terrible cafeteria table during a lunch break. We started talking, and within 10 minutes, she asked to see my laptop. I opened my spreadsheets. I showed her my logistics tracking, my fulfillment systems, and the custom inventory management code I had painstakingly built myself because I could not afford to buy enterprise software. Penelope did not look at the cheap products I was selling. She looked at the engine running underneath them. She saw what my own father had refused to see for a decade. I wasn't just a girl selling trinkets on the internet. I was a structural operator. "You are wasting your time selling these candles and mugs, Evelyn," Penelope said, pointing a manicured finger at my screen. "Your products are mediocre. But your infrastructure? Your fulfillment system? It is brilliant. You need to stop being a retailer and start being a fortress." That single conversation changed my entire trajectory. Penelope became the mentor, and frankly, the mother figure, that Diana never was. Under Penelope's fierce guidance, I executed a massive pivot. I stopped selling my own small products and transformed my business into a comprehensive logistics and commerce ecosystem for other creators. We targeted talented American artisans, woodworkers, ceramic studios, specialty food brands, and independent textile makers. These people knew how to make beautiful, premium products, but they were terrible at the business side. They didn't know how to negotiate shipping rates, handle warehouse fulfillment, or build direct-to-consumer funnels. I provided the entire back-end architecture. My company handled their systems, brand strategy, packaging standards, and wholesale relationships. We built the roads, and we took a percentage of every single cart that drove over them. The growth was explosive. It was violently fast. Once we proved the concept with 10 brands, word spread. Within 2 years, we had 100 brands in our ecosystem. I moved out of the freezing warehouse and leased a massive, state-of-the-art fulfillment center. I hired my first 10 employees, then 20, then 40. I finally slept through the night without worrying about the electric bill. Penelope taught me how to walk into a room of aggressive male investors and command absolute silence. She taught me how to read contracts, how to leverage debt intelligently, and most importantly, how to stop apologizing for my own ambition. By the time I turned 28, my company was a national platform. Analysts in financial magazines kept trying to categorize us, but they couldn't, because half of our immense value was completely invisible to the consumer eye. I wasn't just making money anymore, I was generating real, undeniable power. And as the numbers in my bank account grew from thousands to millions, I realized something terrifying and beautiful. I was actually brilliant. The girl my father called uneducated trash had built an empire that his corporate bosses would have killed to own. By the time I reached 32, my personal stake in the company had officially crossed the $31 million mark. I had turned down 2 massive buyout offers from private equity firms because I wanted control of my empire more than I wanted my name in the headlines. I had a beautiful condo overlooking the city, a diverse and thriving team of employees, and a life that was secure beyond anything my family could comprehend. But I did not tell them. I kept the real numbers a complete and total secret. If you asked me back then why I lied by omission, I would have told you I was just protecting the relationships. I would have said that money changes people and I didn't want things to get weird. But the truth was much uglier and much sadder. Deep down, the little 13-year-old girl who had her painted stools thrown in the trash was still calling the shots. Some broken, unhealed part of me still desperately wanted my father to look at me, see the uncredentialed, ordinary version of Evelyn, and say, "I am proud of you anyway." I wanted them to choose me, just for being me, before the massive success made my value completely undeniable. So, I lived a bizarre double life. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar logistics firm from Monday to Friday, but on Sunday evenings at my parents' house, I played the role of the struggling, eccentric daughter. I deliberately drove my 10-year-old, slightly dented sedan to family dinners instead of buying the luxury SUV I actually wanted. I wore plain, unbranded sweaters and simple jeans. I parked my old car next to Preston's newly leased, flashy sports car and walked into a house where I knew I was about to be the punchline of the evening. The dinners were a masterclass in psychological endurance. We would sit around the heavy oak dining table, and the script was always exactly the same. Preston would dominate the conversation, loudly bragging about his corporate bonuses, throwing around banking terms just to make sure everyone knew he handled big money. Valerie would interject with complaints about her senior partners, making sure to drop the names of the prestigious judges she had met that week. My mother would beam at them, pouring wine, completely intoxicated by the illusion of their high-status lives. And then, the spotlight would invariably turn to me. "So, Evelyn," my father would say, using that same condescending tone he used when I was a teenager, "are you still running that little internet shipping hobby of yours? When are you going to get tired of the hustle and look for a real job with health benefits? You know, Preston's bank is hiring administrative assistants. He could probably get you an interview if you asked nicely." Preston would smirk across the table. "Yeah, I could put in a good word. But you'd have to learn how to dress professionally first, Evie. No more sweatpants." I would sit there, holding my fork, feeling the weight of the $31 million sitting silently in my investment accounts. I knew with absolute certainty that I could buy Preston's entire regional bank branch in cash if I wanted to. I knew my company's quarterly tax bill was larger than my father's entire retirement savings. But I just swallowed the humiliation whole. I would force a polite smile, take a sip of water, and say, "Thanks, Dad. I'll keep that in mind. The hobby is doing fine." I thought my silence was an act of love. I thought taking the high road and letting them have their delusions of superiority was the noble thing to do. I thought that by absorbing their disrespect, I was keeping the family together. But I was wrong. My silence was not healing anything. It was a ticking time bomb. Because while I was sitting there letting them call me a failure, I was also secretly spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep their entire fake, perfect lives from completely falling apart. Thank you for following the story here. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment letting us know which city you're watching from. Every comment helps our channel grow and bring these stories to more people. Thank you so much for your support. The greatest irony of my 20s was that while my family was busy calling me a failure, I was secretly acting as their private bank. They loved the aesthetic of wealth, but they were terrible at managing the reality of it. Preston and Valerie were so obsessed with maintaining their high-status images that they constantly lived right on the razor's edge of financial ruin. And every time they fell off that edge, I was the one standing at the bottom with a safety net, completely out of sight. The first major crisis happened with Preston. He had leveraged his banking salary to buy a massive, overpriced suburban home that he absolutely could not afford, just to impress his colleagues. When the market shifted and his variable interest rate skyrocketed, he started missing payments. He was weeks away from facing a humiliating public foreclosure. He never told me, of course. He only told our parents, who panicked because the optics of a foreclosure would ruin their country club reputation. I found out through a tearful phone call my mother made to my aunt, which I accidentally overheard. I did not want Preston to lose his home, but I also knew he would rather burn the house down than accept a loan from his college dropout sister. So, I hired a third-party lawyer. We set up an anonymous shell company, reached out to Preston's bank, and structured a private grant to cover his arrears and refinance his mortgage. He walked away thinking he had magically negotiated a miracle. He never knew it was my money keeping a roof over his head. Then there was Valerie's wedding. Valerie wanted a wedding that looked like it belonged in a bridal magazine. She hired an incredibly expensive, highly sought-after vendor to handle the floral arrangements and the catering. 1 week before the wedding, that vendor abruptly filed for bankruptcy and completely shut down operations, taking Valerie's massive deposit with them. Valerie was hysterical. The wedding was going to be an empty hall with no food and no decorations. Again, she didn't ask me for help. I was just the sister who was supposed to sit quietly in the back row. But I could not let her special day be ruined. I utilized my company's massive logistics network. I pulled favors from 4 different high-end artisan food suppliers and 3 wholesale floral distributors in my ecosystem. I paid an astronomical premium out of my own pocket to have everything shipped overnight and arranged in secret. I routed it all through Valerie's wedding planner, strictly instructing her to take the credit. At the reception, Valerie gave a tearful toast thanking the wedding planner for pulling off a miracle. I raised my glass of champagne and smiled. Even my parents were not immune to my secret bailouts. When my mother, Diana, needed a specialized surgery that her insurance refused to fully cover, the hospital bills started piling up. My father's pride would not allow him to ask for a payment plan, so the stress in the house became unbearable. I quietly contacted the hospital's billing department, used my corporate trust account, and paid the entire remaining balance in full. When the zero balance statement arrived in the mail, my father arrogantly assumed the insurance company had finally recognized his aggressive complaint letters and backed down. He spent the entire Sunday dinner bragging about how he had beaten the system. I funded their delusions. I paid for the very ground they stood on while they looked down on me. I thought that by doing it anonymously, I was being the bigger person. I thought I was protecting their fragile egos because I loved them. I did not realize that I was just paying for my own continued abuse. The breaking point arrived on my father's 60th birthday. As the milestone approached, I felt a deep, overwhelming exhaustion settling into my bones. I was 32 years old. I was the CEO of a $31 million enterprise. I managed dozens of employees, negotiated with national distributors, and navigated incredibly complex corporate challenges every single day. Yet, every time I crossed the threshold of my parents' house, I was magically reduced to a helpless, uneducated teenager. I was tired of shrinking myself to make them feel tall. I was tired of the double life. I decided that for his 60th birthday, I was going to give my father a gift that would finally, definitively prove who I was. It was not meant to be a weapon. It was not meant to be an act of revenge. In my naive heart, I genuinely believed that if I showed them the irrefutable proof of my success, presented with love and securing their future, the toxic dynamic would finally shatter. I thought the truth would set us all free. I sat down with my chief financial officer and my wealth management team. Together, we structured a beautiful, fully funded, ironclad retirement portfolio. It was designed to generate enough passive income that my father could immediately retire from his stressful engineering firm without sacrificing a single ounce of his lifestyle. It included premium healthcare coverage for both him and my mother for the rest of their lives. It was the ultimate safety net, wrapped in a legal trust. I printed the summary documents, placed them in a sleek leather folder, and drove to their house for the birthday dinner. The evening started exactly as these dinners always did. My mother fussed over the roast beef, complaining about the neighbors. Preston spent the first 20 minutes complaining about the federal interest rates and how hard his job as a senior wealth manager was. Valerie dominated the middle of the dinner by analyzing a tort law case she was assisting on, making sure to remind everyone that she had graduated near the top of her class. My father sat at the head of the table, sipping his red wine, basking in the glow of his two credentialed, successful children. I sat quietly, eating my vegetables, waiting for the right moment. Nobody asked me how my week was. Nobody asked about my business. The only time I was addressed was when Preston joked that I should probably start looking for a husband soon, since my little shipping hustle wasn't exactly going to provide a stable pension. I just smiled, my hand resting on the leather folder in my lap. I thought about how quickly his smirk was going to vanish. When my mother brought out the birthday cake and we finished singing, it was time for gifts. Preston gave my father an expensive bottle of scotch. Valerie gave him a designer watch. My father beamed, thanking them for being such thoughtful, accomplished kids. Then, the room fell quiet as everyone looked at me. They were expecting me to hand over a cheap gift card or a handmade sweater. I took a deep breath, slid the leather folder across the dining table, and placed it right next to his birthday cake. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady and warm. "I wanted to give you something that actually matters. Something for your future." My father looked at the folder suspiciously. He opened it slowly, put on his reading glasses, and began to scan the first page. The silence in the dining room grew heavy. I waited for his eyes to widen. I waited for the realization, the shock, and finally, the pride. But as his eyes darted across the numbers, his face did not soften. It hardened. The color drained from his cheeks, replaced by a dark, angry red. He looked up at me, not with gratitude, but with absolute fury. "What exactly is this supposed to be, Evelyn?" my father asked, his voice shaking with a dangerous kind of energy. He dropped the documents onto the table like they were infected with a disease. I kept my voice calm. "It is a fully funded retirement trust. My company recently crossed a major valuation milestone. I have secured enough capital to guarantee that you and Mom never have to worry about money, mortgages, or medical bills ever again. You can retire tomorrow if you want to." Preston let out a loud, ugly snort. He reached over, snatched the papers, and looked at the numbers. "Oh, come on," Preston laughed, tossing the folder back. "This is one of those fake internet money scams, isn't it? You print out some hypothetical spreadsheet to make yourself look like a big shot? Dad, do not sign anything she gives you. She is probably trying to use your credit." Valerie rolled her eyes, groaning loudly. "Evelyn, this is incredibly tacky. Why do you always have to make everything about your weird little brand? Please do not ruin Dad's 60th birthday with your delusions of grandeur." My mother looked at me with deep disappointment. "Evelyn, please put those papers away. We're having a nice family evening." I looked around the table. They were completely rejecting reality because the reality did not fit the narrative they had spent over a decade building. "It is not a scam, Preston," I said, my voice rising just a fraction. "It is real cash. Real investments. I own a logistics ecosystem valued at $31 million. I built it from nothing. And I am trying to take care of this family. My father slammed his fist onto the table, making the wine glasses violently rattle. Take care of us, he roared. You think you can walk in here, a college dropout, a girl who paints trash in the garage, and wave a piece of paper in my face and act like you are my equal? You think your uneducated internet hustle buys you respect in this house? Something inside me finally snapped. The years of biting my tongue, the years of silent endurance, suddenly felt like poison. I am not trying to buy your respect, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. I am already taking care of you. All of you. The room went dead silent. What are you talking about? Valerie demanded. I turned to my brother first. Preston. 3 years ago, when you were 30 days away from the bank foreclosing on your house, you didn't get a miracle anonymous grant. That was my money. I paid your arrears. I saved you from bankruptcy. Preston's face went completely white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I turned to my sister. Valerie, your wedding. When your vendor went bankrupt, the wedding planner did not pull off a miracle. I used my corporate freight trucks to ship those flowers and that food across 3 state lines overnight. I paid the $40,000 premium out of my own pocket, so you wouldn't cry at the altar. Valerie shrank back in her chair, looking horrified. I finally looked at my parents. And Mom's surgery. The insurance company did not suddenly change their minds. I paid the hospital directly. I have been holding this family together with the money you constantly tell me is worthless. I did not say it to be cruel. I said it because I was suffocating under the weight of their lies, and I just wanted the truth to exist in the room for 5 minutes. But my father did not see the love behind the sacrifice. He only saw the utter destruction of his ego. The idea that the daughter he viewed as a peasant had been secretly funding his aristocratic illusions was too much for his pride to bear. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair crashed backwards onto the floor. His face was unrecognizable, twisted with a rage I had never seen before. You manipulative little parasite, he screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You think you can humiliate me in my own home? You think money changes who you are? You are nothing. You are still uneducated trash with a lucky streak. Then, louder, so the neighbors could probably hear, he yelled the words that would end our family forever. Get out of my house, you uneducated trash. Get out, you lowlife, and do not ever come back here acting like you are one of us. I sat perfectly still for 3 seconds. I looked at my mother, who was staring at the floor, refusing to defend me. I looked at Preston and Valerie, who were paralyzed by the exposure of their own failures. I looked at my father, who was breathing heavily, waiting for me to cry, waiting for me to break down and apologize for being successful. I slowly stood up. I picked up my purse. I looked my father dead in the eye, my face a mask of absolute calm, and said 2 words. Okay, fine. I turned around and walked out the front door. I did not slam it. I did not run. I just walked to my car, got in, and drove away. I did not shed a single tear. The wound did not hurt anymore. It was completely cauterized. I sat in my car in the driveway for exactly 2 minutes before turning the key. I expected to feel devastated. I expected the familiar crushing weight of rejection to press down on my chest. But instead, as I stared at the perfectly manicured lawn of my childhood home for the last time, I felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating armor I had worn for 32 years had just fallen off. The worst thing they could do to me had already been done, and I had survived it. I drove straight to my condo. I did not pack frantically. I packed with cold, surgical precision. I boxed up the few personal items I cared about, grabbed my important documents, and left the rest of the furniture behind. I opened my phone and systematically blocked my father, my mother, Preston, and Valerie. I exited the family group chat without a single word. I left my business lines open, but as far as my blood relatives were concerned, Evelyn no longer existed on their grid. By 3 in the morning, my car was loaded. I pulled out onto the highway and began the 11-hour drive south to Savannah, Georgia. A year prior, I had quietly purchased a restored historic cottage in Savannah as an investment property. It sat near the coast, surrounded by massive oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. It was supposed to be a place I might retire to decades from now, but as the highway miles rolled by in the dark, I realized it was exactly where my new life needed to begin. Indianapolis was a monument to who I wasn't. Savannah was going to be the fortress of who I actually was. I arrived just as the sun was setting over the marsh. The humidity was thick and warm, a stark contrast to the coldness of the Midwest. The first few days were a blur of deep, restorative sleep and quiet unpacking. I stripped the cottage of anything generic. I filled the rooms with handmade ceramics, woven textiles, and heavy wooden furniture crafted by the very artisans my company supported. I created an environment built entirely on authentic labor, completely devoid of hollow prestige. By the second week, I realized the house was too quiet. I drove to a local animal shelter and walked past the rows of barking, jumping puppies, straight to the very back kennel. Sitting there was an older, mixed-breed dog with sad brown eyes and one ear completely torn off from an old fight. The tag on her cage said nobody wanted her because she looked damaged. I adopted her immediately, named her Hazel, and let her sleep at the foot of my bed. We were two damaged things, finally safe in a house of our own. I also needed a purpose outside of my daily corporate meetings. I leased a bright, airy studio space in downtown Savannah and launched an incubator program for female entrepreneurs. I wanted to find the women who had been told their ideas were cute little hobbies. I wanted to find the college dropouts, the single mothers, the women without the right pedigrees, and teach them how to build unbreakable supply chains. The first workshop was supposed to have 15 people. 50 showed up. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who spoke my exact language, and the ghost of my father's judgment finally began to fade. Exactly 3 weeks after the explosive birthday dinner, I was sitting on my front porch in Savannah. It was a humid Saturday afternoon. I was barefoot, drinking iced tea, reviewing a massive contract on my tablet while Hazel slept in a patch of sunlight by my feet. Then I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I looked up and saw a car with Indiana license plates. The driver's door opened and Preston stepped out. He looked absolutely terrible. He was not wearing his usual tailored suit. He was in wrinkled clothes, his eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like he had driven 11 hours straight through the night without stopping. He walked up the steps to my porch, panting slightly in the thick southern heat. He did not start with an apology. He didn't even say hello. He tried to put on his old, superior mask, but his voice was trembling. Dad was just stressed, Evelyn, Preston started, shoving his hands into his pockets. Birthdays make people emotional. You took the whole thing entirely too personally. You shouldn't have just run away like a child. Mom is a wreck. I didn't stand up. I just looked at him, petting Hazel's head. Why are you here, Preston? He swallowed hard, the arrogant facade instantly crumbling. He practically collapsed into the wicker chair opposite me. I made a mistake, Evie. A really bad one. I did a margin call on a private investment account at the bank. I thought I could beat the market, but it tanked. The bank's compliance officers are going to audit my accounts on Monday morning. If they see the deficit, I will lose my job. I might face charges. I need cash. Today. Just a temporary bridge loan to cover the gap. You said you had 31 million. I only need 400,000. It's nothing to you. He had driven 1,000 miles not to check on his sister, but to access the very money he had called fake 3 weeks prior. The absolute audacity of it was almost impressive. Before I could say a single word, my tablet rang. It was a scheduled video call with my chief financial officer and our legal team regarding our newest expansion. I didn't mute it. I didn't walk inside. I answered the call right there on the porch, putting it on speaker so the volume echoed clearly in the humid air. Evelyn, my CFO said briskly. The licensing agreement with the national retail chain is finalized. They agreed to our terms. We're looking at a 7-figure injection by Tuesday, and we retain full control of the logistics software. Excellent work, I replied, keeping my eyes locked dead on Preston's pale face. Execute the contract. Approve the wire transfers for the new warehouse expansions. I'll review the final dockets tonight. Will do. Have a good weekend, boss. I ended the call. The porch fell silent again, except for the sound of the cicadas in the trees. Preston was staring at me like he was looking at a ghost. He finally realized that the little sister he had mocked for a decade was operating on a level of power he would never even touch. So, Preston whispered, his voice cracking. Will you help me? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Preston, you stood in a dining room 3 weeks ago and laughed while our father called me uneducated trash. You have spent your entire life treating me like dirt to make yourself feel tall. And now you want me to save you from your own incompetence. We are blood, he pleaded, his voice rising in panic. You cannot just let me lose everything. Watch me, I said softly. The answer is no. Not now. Not tomorrow. Never again. You are not getting a single dime of the money you despised. Now get off my porch. He tried to argue, but I stood up, and Hazel let out a low, warning growl. Preston stumbled back down the steps, furious, humiliated, and utterly defeated. He got into his car and drove away. I sat back down, picked up my iced tea, and went back to reading my contracts. When Preston drove back to Indianapolis empty-handed, he could not keep his mouth shut. Desperate and angry, he told our parents exactly what he had seen. He told them about the coastal house, the 7-figure business calls, and the absolute reality of my wealth. The myth they had built around me, the myth of the struggling, foolish dropout, began to crack. But what completely destroyed their narrative wasn't Preston's panicked report. It was the media. A month after I moved to Savannah, a major national business journal decided to run a feature on non-traditional entrepreneurship. My mentor, Penelope, had connected me with a senior editor who was fascinated by my company's infrastructure model. The journalist flew down, interviewed me for 2 days, and published a massive, glowing cover story. The headline read, "The $31 million empire built by a college dropout." The article was brilliantly written. It detailed my logistics ecosystem, the hundreds of artisans we supported, and the ruthless efficiency of our operations. But the journalist also asked about my background, and I answered honestly. I did not name my family members, but I spoke candidly about the toxic nature of credential worship. I was quoted saying, "Sometimes the people who claim to protect you are actually just trying to bury the version of you they cannot control." Family skepticism is often just sabotage disguised as concern. In the age of the internet, a national article does not stay quiet for long. It was syndicated, shared on LinkedIn, and blasted across entrepreneurship newsletters. Within a week, it hit Indianapolis like a meteor. Suddenly, my father's carefully curated public image was on fire. He had spent years at his engineering firm lecturing his colleagues about the absolute necessity of traditional education and corporate loyalty. He had subtly used me as a cautionary tale of what happens when you abandon the right path. Now, every executive in his building was reading a glossy magazine article about how his own daughter had built a company vastly more innovative than their own firm, specifically because she rejected his path. The humiliation was swift and brutal. Younger managers at his firm started leaving copies of the magazine in the break room. Men who had listened to his arrogant rants for years began asking him, with thin, polite smiles, if he was asking his millionaire daughter for business advice yet. My father could not handle it. His ego, which required total submission from everyone around him, fractured. He lost his temper in a staff meeting, yelling at a junior engineer who simply brought up my company as a case study. Within 2 months, the firm's leadership quietly pulled him aside and strongly suggested he take an early retirement package. It was a polite firing. His career ended not with a gold watch and a grand speech, but with a quiet, embarrassed exit. Preston's fate was even more satisfying. After failing to secure my money, his margin call was discovered. But that wasn't the only thing compliance found. They discovered that for the past year, Preston had been aggressively pitching clients by lying about having a back-channel relationship with my logistics company. He had been promising vendors priority access to my supply chains to win their banking portfolios. When the article dropped and it became painfully obvious that I was completely estranged from him, his clients complained. He didn't just lose his promotion, he was formally written up for gross misrepresentation and moved to a dead-end desk job. The golden children had finally tarnished. Just when I thought the dust had settled, the universe delivered a twist so incredibly ironic that I actually laughed out loud when I read the email. The massive industrial engineering firm where my father had worked for 35 years, the very place that had just forced him into early retirement, was sponsoring a prestigious regional summit on innovation, supply chain resilience, and the future of commerce. The organizing committee, entirely unaware of the deep family drama, had read the national magazine feature on my company. One of their senior directors reached out and formally invited me to be the keynote speaker. The proposed title for my speech was Success Beyond the Credential, Building the Future Without a Blueprint. It was a masterstroke of cosmic justice. My father would not only have to hear about my success, he would be expected to attend the summit as a newly retired senior alumnus and watch his entire corporate religion bow down to the daughter he had kicked out into the street. I accepted the invitation immediately. As soon as my name was announced on the summit's public itinerary, my phone started ringing. Since I had blocked their numbers, the voicemails began piling up in my blocked messages folder. My mother called first. Her voice was trembling, stripped of all her usual country club arrogance. She begged me to come home for a private dinner before the summit. She said my father was severely depressed, that Preston was barely speaking, and that the family needed to heal privately. Valerie sent long, frantic emails to my corporate address, saying that appearing at the summit would be a public humiliation for Dad and that I needed to cancel to show grace. They still didn't get it. They still wanted to sweep the abuse under the rug. They wanted a quiet, secret reconciliation so they could save face in front of their friends. I finally replied to Valerie with a single email, copying my mother and Preston. I will not cancel the speech. And there will be no private dinners. You spent your entire lives publicly minimizing me to protect Dad's pride. If you want any form of relationship with me moving forward, the healing will not be done in the shadows. You will tell the extended family the truth. You will admit what happened. If I don't have proof that you have taken accountability before my plane lands in Indianapolis, I will deliver my speech and leave, and you will never hear from me again. It was the ultimate ultimatum. I was not asking for an apology anymore. I was demanding absolute public truth. I knew they were terrified of the gossip of our aunts, uncles, and cousins. But I also knew they were even more terrified of losing their connection to me permanently, now that the whole world knew exactly what I was worth. I flew into Indianapolis on a crisp, clear Thursday morning. I wore a tailored, sharp suit that Penelope had helped me pick out. I looked like a woman who owned the room before she even stepped into it. I took a black car straight to the downtown convention center. The lobby was packed with executives, engineers, and students wearing lanyards, milling around the coffee stations. When I walked backstage to prepare for my keynote, I found Valerie waiting by the curtain. She looked incredibly small, nervously gripping her expensive handbag. She didn't try to hug me. She knew she hadn't earned the right. "Evelyn," she said softly, her voice shaking. She pulled out her phone and handed it to me. "You asked for proof. Here." I pressed play on the screen. It was a recording of a massive family video call from the night before. Every aunt, uncle, and older cousin was in the grid. In the center of the screen sat my mother and father, looking like they were facing a firing squad. I watched as my mother, crying genuine tears this time, admitted to the entire extended family that they had driven me away. She confessed that I had been paying their bills for years. Then my father spoke. The arrogant, booming voice of the senior engineer was entirely gone. He sounded hollow. He looked at the camera and said, "I let my pride destroy my family. I insulted the daughter who saved us. I confused education with character, and I was wrong." It was brutal to watch. It wasn't a cinematic, heartwarming redemption. It was the painful, ugly extraction of a toxic tumor. But it was real. I handed the phone back to Valerie. "Thank you," I said simply. "Dad is out there," she whispered, pointing toward the stage. "Front row." The moderator announced my name, and the crowd erupted into polite applause. I walked out from behind the curtain and stepped up to the acrylic podium. The auditorium was massive, filled with hundreds of people. And right there, in the dead center of the front row, sat Harrison, my father. Beside him was my mother, clutching a tissue, and Preston, staring at his shoes. I didn't use the teleprompter. I looked directly out into the crowd and began to speak. I talked about the mechanics of supply chains. I talked about how the traditional models of business were failing because they relied on outdated blueprints. And then I seamlessly transitioned into the human element. For decades, we have been told that talent only arrives in a specific package, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent hall. We demand degrees. We demand pedigrees. We build walls around our industries and our homes, and we demand that people show us a piece of paper before we grant them basic dignity. But innovation does not care about your diploma. Resilience is not taught in a lecture hall. It is forged when the heating breaks in your warehouse, and you have to choose between payroll and staying warm. I paused, letting my eyes drop directly to my father. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. A person's true value, I continued, my voice unwavering, is revealed long before their resume impresses you. The ultimate test of character is not how you treat a successful CEO. The ultimate test of character is how you treat someone when you think they are beneath you. When you think they have nothing to offer you. If you dismiss the builders, the makers, and the dreamers because they do not fit your script, you will eventually find yourself standing in the ruins of the very empire you thought you were protecting. When I finished my speech and thanked the crowd, the room did not just applaud. They stood up. A standing ovation from the very people my father had idolized his entire life. I looked down at him one last time. He was standing too, his hands clapping slowly, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. He was defeated. Completely and utterly defeated by the truth. After the keynote, the organizers hosted a small VIP reception in a side room. The firm's executives swarmed me, shaking my hand, asking about investment opportunities, and praising my insights. My father hung near the back of the room, looking like a ghost haunting a place he used to rule. Eventually, the crowd thinned, and my family approached me in the quiet corridor outside the reception hall. There was no screaming this time. There was no arrogance. My father stood before me, his shoulders slumped. He looked a decade older than he had just a few months ago. "Evelyn," he started, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry. I was terrified of you. Your success made my entire life feel unnecessary. I followed all the rules, and you broke them all, and you still won. I punished you for my own insecurities." My mother cried quietly, apologizing for being a spectator to his cruelty. Preston mumbled a hollow apology, unable to look me in the eye. Valerie just nodded, accepting the reality of the situation. I listened to all of them. I let them empty their guilt onto the table. But I did not give them the cinematic Hollywood ending they desperately wanted. I did not throw my arms around them and tell them everything was forgiven and forgotten. Healing does not mean erasing the past just to make the abusers feel comfortable. "I appreciate you saying that, Dad. I really do," I said calmly. "But apologies do not build time machines. The only relationship we are going to have moving forward is one built on strict boundaries. There will be no access to my business. There will be no loans. There will be no surprise visits to Savannah. You can email me. We can maybe have a polite phone call on holidays. But I will not pretend that we are a happy, perfect family. I am protecting my peace, and that is not up for negotiation." He nodded slowly, wiping his face. "I understand. I really do." I walked out of the convention center, got into my car, and went straight to the airport. I flew back to Savannah that same evening. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my coastal cottage, it was nearly midnight. The thick, warm southern air wrapped around me like a blanket. I unlocked the front door, and Hazel immediately trotted over, her tail wagging furiously, her one ear perked up in joy. I knelt down on the hardwood floor and hugged her tight. I walked out onto my back porch and looked out at the dark water of the marsh reflecting the moonlight. For years, I had thought that revenge meant screaming back. I thought revenge meant destroying the people who hurt you until they felt the exact same pain. But standing there, listening to the quiet breathing of my dog and the wind in the oak trees, I finally understood the truth. The most powerful revenge is not destruction. The greatest revenge is letting the truth stand still long enough for them to see their own ugly reflections in it. The ultimate victory was building a life so incredibly solid, so full of authentic purpose, that their approval, their judgments, and their opinions simply became irrelevant background noise. I did not need my father's validation anymore. I did not need my family to choose me. I had already chosen myself, and that was the only credential I would ever need. I walked away and built a fortress around my peace, letting them live with the echoes of their own cruelty. Am I the jerk for completely refusing to give my family a real second chance, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching and listening to this story. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the crazy stories we share here. Stay strong and see you in the next video.